Good afternoon. I'm Fred Leong, Professor of Psychology and Director of the Consortium for Multicultural Psychology Research. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2015 Annual Distinguished Lecture on Multicultural Psychology. We're very pleased to have Professor Susan Fiske from Princeton University give this year's lecture. But before I introduce Susan, I'd like to take care of a couple of items. First, I'd like to remind everyone that we will be having a reception with light refreshments and drinks at the end of the presentation from 5 to 6 upstairs in room 230. Everyone is invited, and I hope that many of you can stay for the reception, which is to honor our invited speaker and also the winner of the 2015 Joseph L. White Outstanding Student Multicultural Research Award. Next, I'm pleased to continue our tradition of presenting the Joseph White Outstanding Student Multicultural Research Award at the beginning of our annual distinguished lecture. To present this year's award, I'd like to introduce Professor Daisy Chang, who is chair of the CMPR Awards Committee. You want to speak into this? You got to speak into this.
Really?
So it's recorded.
Oh.
We're videotaping.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Fred. My name is Daisy Chang, and I'm the chair of this year's CMPR Award Committee. And on behalf of my committee members, Bill Davidson and John Schauberg, I'm pleased to announce the winner of this year's Joseph White Outstanding Student Multicultural Research Award to one of our own organizational psych graduate students. Okay, I'm gonna butcher her name, so I apologize in advance. Abdelfatah Ali. So. And I have to say, this is actually the first time I have to say his first name. Usually we call him by triple A. So congratulations, triple A. All right, cool, thank you.
There's an honorarium that goes with this too, which I think Ali's already spent. Okay, congratulations, Ali, and my thanks again to the awards committee. Now to our main event. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our invited speaker. Susan Fiske is the Eugene Higgins Professor of Psychology and Public Affairs at Princeton University with PhD from Harvard, and she also has honorary doctorates from Belgium, Netherlands, and Switzerland. She investigates social cognition, especially cognitive stereotypes and emotional prejudice at cultural, interpersonal, and neuroscientific levels. Author of over 300 publications and winner of numerous scientific awards, she has most recently been elected to the National Academy of Sciences. Her just published book is The Human Brand: How We Relate to People, Products, and Companies with Chris Malone. Sponsored by Guggenheim, her 2011 Russell Sage Foundation book is Envy Up, Scorn Down: How Status Divides Us. With Shelley Taylor, she has written 4 editions for classic texts, Social Cognition. Currently an editor of the Annual Review of Psychology, PNAS, and Policy Insights from Behavioral and Brain Sciences. She's also the president of the Federation of Associations of Behavioral and Brain Sciences. The U.S. Supreme Court cited her gender bias testimony, and she testified before President Clinton's Race Initiative Advisory Board. These influenced her 2008 edited volume, Beyond Common Sense: Psychological Science in the Courtroom. Currently an editor of the Handbook of Social Psychology, she's written an upper-level text, Social Beings, Core Motives in Social Psychology, and past recipient of the American Psychological Association's Distinguished Scientific Contributions Award and the Association for Psychological Science William James Award. She's previously been elected to President of the Association for Psychological Science, the FABS Foundation, Fellow of the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences, and Fellow of the American Philosophical Society, and Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Because it takes a village, her graduate students conspired for her to win the Princeton's Mentoring Award. So the title of Susan's presentation today is The Power of Positive Speaking, Talking Up and Talking Down. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Susan Fiske.
This one's on the left, yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, I think so. Okay, I'm going to need the people in the back to tell me if they can't hear me. So if you can't hear me at some point during the conversation, just raise your hand, because I think we want to keep the fans on, so I can keep my fans.
The mic is on.
This mic is not on, it's only for the
The mic
recording.
is only for the videotaping. We don't have a.
Can we use the other mic, the room mic? It's in the box right there.
Do you know how to set up the microphone?
Yeah.
Okay,
Somebody could help me set up the microphone. I've never taught in here, so I've never used the microphone. Just set up.
oh, look at that.
Then we can do both.
I'll teach them yours.
Okay, well, let's put it in this pocket.
Double-sided.
That's right, I can take them out and,
I hope they don't interfere with each other.
well,
You
we'll
can
see.
just put it here.
Well, I'd rather have it,
Okay.
I feel like R2-D2. Is it on? Testing, testing. Is the mic on? You did. Yeah, it is.
You want it louder?
No, you don't want it louder, really.
If you need it, it's just right here. I'll take it.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Okay, somehow I feel like R2-D2 or something. A little wired. Well, thank you for being here, and I appreciate coming to give this talk, because studying multicultural issues really goes back to my childhood. Growing up in Hyde Park in Chicago, I thought the world was a pretty varied, diverse, cosmopolitan place, and then I began to live other places, and I said, oh, wait a minute, why is the rest of the world not like this? Not that Hyde Park is perfect or anything, but my experience of it as a kid was that people valued the internationalism and the racial diversity of it, and the fact that it was a stable, multicultural place, and then I realized that wasn't how the rest of the world operates. So this gives me, a lifetime's worth of work to do, and those of us who are in the prejudice game are not going to be out of work anytime soon, unfortunately. This particular talk focuses in on status hierarchies, which is only one dimension of bias, but the effort is to find some general principles that cut across different kinds of multicultural bias. And I do want to say that it does take a village, and the people who are listed as co-authors on this talk are genuine co-authors, because a lot of the ideas are their ideas, but they somehow all related to each other, and there's a story to tell. So what I'm going to make it's a multi-part argument. Polite communicators omit negativity when they're describing other people. This negativity omission turns out to create innuendo, which I will show you allows stereotypes to stagnate over time. Listeners get it. They hear the innuendo and infer negativity from what's been omitted. Even impression managers use positive innuendo and downplay one dimension to convey the other. I'll go more into that in a minute. And status turns out to determine which strategy people use when, so that you have a paradox whereby high status speakers are talking down warmly and low status speakers are talking up competently, and they're doing two different things and they're in the same room. It's a problem. So this is basically a conspiracy paranoid theory about how status gets maintained. So the positivity bias in psychology is well documented. I could have given you a whole raft of citations to this effect. It's seen in language use, not just in the United States, but elsewhere too. It's certainly seen in evaluations of people. So as a social cognition researcher, when somebody has a 9-point scale, the midpoint of the scale is not the numerical midpoint. It's a little to the high end of that. So a person basically you're only using half the scale, because nobody wants to rate anybody below the midpoint of the scale. And so functionally the scale is more positive or less positive, not positive and negative. And this is universal enough that it gets included in algebraic models of impression formation and impression reports. The same thing turns out to be true when people are describing groups, at least in polite society. I'm not saying there aren't raging bigots in the world who will say bad things about other groups, but say 80% of the American population or 90% of the American population really understands that it's impolite to be racist, and they try not to say bad things about groups. And so I'll show you some evidence of that. So positivity biases in general suggest that people will omit negative information, especially if they're worried about self-presentation, if they're talking to a public audience instead of just to themselves. This is especially easy to do if you have an ambivalent impression, because you can report the positive aspects of the impression and just fail to mention the negative ones. And so one of the things that people do is they follow the Gricean rules generally of being relevant and complete, but there's this additional rule of not being negative. And so people don't lie about other people. They don't make up something that's the opposite of what they believe. They just manage not to say it. The dimensions that we talk about in talking about this work rely on the stereotype content model. So in our work, this is Amy Cuddy. If you haven't seen her TED Talk, it's the second or third most watched TED Talk. And she has 27,000 Twitter followers. This is a world I don't even begin to understand how she did it, but I'm proud anyway. And then Peter Glick is also a co-author on the stereotype content model. So what we find in the stereotype content model is that the two dimensions that people use to make sense of other people are warmth and competence. The warmth decision is whether the other person has good intentions or bad intentions toward you. It's like the sentry who calls out in the night, "Halt, who goes there, friend or foe?" You need to know that. It's a matter of life and death. And once people have inferred the other's intentions, then they need to know whether the other has the competence to act on those intentions, because they don't matter so much if they can't act on their intentions. So I just want to make it clear that I don't think that we invented these two dimensions. Going back to Solomon Asch, there's been plenty of other people who've thought of similar dimensions. If you squint, they all look the same. And I tend to be a lumper rather than a splitter, so I squint a lot. But my point is, if a lot of people have invented these ideas in parallel over time, probably there's something right about it. So for those of you who haven't come across the stereotype content model, let me just talk briefly about it, and then I'll go into the main part of the talk. So the stereotype content model splits groups into low warmth and high warmth, that is, groups that are seen as trustworthy and well-intentioned and friendly and sincere, and groups that are not, and groups that are seen as low competence and high competence to act on those intentions. So in the low part of the space, what you see is around the world, by the way, this is true, that poor people are seen as having bad intentions, being untrustworthy, and being incompetent. What's, from a cultural point of view, particularly interesting is that people without an address are also here. So homeless people in the United States, immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants, Roma in Europe, Bedouins in that part of the world. It's really interesting. Basically, people without refugees, anybody without an address is seen as useless and even disgusting. In the opposite corner, you see the in-group, its allies and reference groups. In all the countries that we've looked at so far, citizens of that country are seen as high, the middle class in the United States. It's the reference group that people hold up as being the exemplar. So this main diagonal of the model is interesting, but not so original with us. You could get this from the basic in-group, out-group research. What's unique to our model are the ambivalent parts of the space. So what you see from these two dimensions is you can have combinations that are high on warmth, well-intentioned, but incompetent. And all over the world, old people fall into this part of the space. And all you cultural psychologists out there, I'm sure you're thinking, not in Asia. Guess what? Asia too. We can talk about that later. There are a couple exceptions we can talk about. But anyway, the point is that people with disabilities and older people are seen as well-intentioned and nice, but not so competent, effective, and useful. And so people feel pity toward them, which is an ambivalent emotion. It says, I feel sorry for you and feel sympathy for you, but only as long as you stay in your low-status place. At the opposite extreme are groups that are seen as cold but competent. All around the world, rich people are seen this way, seen as having resources and status, but not being very nice. And people report feeling envy toward them, which is also an ambivalent emotion, because it says, you have something I wish I had, and I'll try to take it away from you if I can. So these are the two ambivalent parts of the space, and they're very useful to the talk I want to give today. But just so that you don't think I'm saying universal lightly, we've now looked at the stereotype content model in samples from all over the world, And what we find is if you ask people what the local groups are that are talked about, and the groups they belong to, and the groups that are the worst case kind of groups, what you see is you then ask a second group of people about how these groups measure up on warmth and competence. What you see is that the groups always spread out across the space. The patterns are not identical except for the ones I was just telling you about, which are pretty consistent. Different ethnic groups fit into these different parts of the space, so it meets at least the eyeball test. You look at it, you say, oh look, these two dimensions differentiate, and besides, I feel like I have a rough and ready cultural map of how the groups relate to each other in society. This is Federica Durante, who's organizing our current effort and organized the most recent publication that we have. And I want to thank Michelle Gelfand, who many of you may know, who has helped us to gather data in high conflict Middle Eastern countries that we couldn't possibly have had access to without her. Some of the dynamics vary by country. Okay, so in this context of wanting to use the warmth and competence space, then let me talk to you about the argument that we're trying to make here. So the first step in the argument is that communicators, polite communicators at least, omit negativity. This work was spearheaded by Hilary Bergseeker, who's now at the University of Waterloo. And the first step in this was to take the compensation effect for warmth and competence. So Chick Judd and Vincent Iserbit and Nico Kervin and their colleagues have discovered a phenomenon in this warmth and competence space, whereas in a comparative context, if you mention that one group is warm, they will assume the other group is competent. If you mention that one group is competent, they'll assume the other group is warm, and also it works for the negative ones too. So there seems to be a sort of a trade-off that people assume that groups specialize in warmth and competence in a comparative context. And there's a hydraulic relationship between warmth and competence. So if the group is warm, it's not competent. And if it's competent, it's not warm. So even though in our space we see groups in all four quadrants, in many countries, the majority of the groups are in the ambivalent parts of the space. And so people make this assumption about the trade-off between the two dimensions. So we were intrigued by this finding and we're interested in how it plays out in communications about groups. So negativity omission, remember I said if you've got this trade-off, right, then you can talk about the positive dimension and just omit the negative dimension, whichever one it is. It follows the positivity norm, it also follows the accuracy norm because you're not lying. So in the first studies we looked at how people describe other individuals. Very simple design. The other individual was lower high on warmth and lower high on competence, which gives you two ambivalent and two univalent combinations. You lost the mic? Oh. Oh, it says low battery. Okay, I'm going to shout while she does this. Okay. Oh, it just came back on. So in fact, the next moment is some silent reading anyway. Good timing. It's a good thing you teach in this room.
It happens to me all the time, right in the middle.
I wonder what you were whispering about. Now I know.
Okay, and you're back.
That works.
That woke you up. Okay, thanks a lot. So this is the design. It's a very simple, straightforward design. So we did 3 studies with this design. The first study was, what's your likelihood of saying warmth and competence adjectives to a casual acquaintance? In the second study, we decided to ramp up people's self-presentation concern for white subjects. Having a black target would tend to do that. And we also manipulated the audience. That is, would you say this to yourself? Would you say it to a friend? Would you say it to a casual acquaintance? And we predict a linear increase in a negativity omission with that kind of thing. And we get it. In study 3, we manipulated the audience, but we did it between subjects in case there was some kind of demand thing going on with the within subjects manipulation in study 2. And we looked at mediation by a variety of things, including self-presentation, which is our sense of what's going on, not so much uncertainty or concerns about honesty. Okay, I'm going to put up a three-way interaction, but we're going to understand it together, I promise you. Okay, so this is 3 studies, study 1, study 2, study 3. This is the likelihood that you would make a statement reflecting both dimensions, or make a statement, well, I'll explain, that you'd make the statement. So when the person is intelligent and kind, the most popular responses are to make a complete report or to omit just one of the dimensions. And making something up inaccurate is really unpopular. When the person is neither intelligent nor kind, you can see the whole frequency of saying anything at all goes way down. And people don't lie so much, and it's about even for omission and complete reports. But the most interesting part is when the person is high on one dimension and low on the other, and you can see that by far the most popular choice in the ambivalent case is the gray bar, which is the omission of the negative content. That's what people choose to do and report that they would choose to do the most often. So this is all to a casual acquaintance. The mediation analysis on 2 different omission measures. One was a statement-based choice, so we gave people statements, and they rated their likelihood of using those statements. And then in another case, we had open-ended descriptions that they would write that we then coded for the use of warmth and competence adjectives. Either one works the same way, and they're reported the audience effect in the case where we had the 3 audiences, self, friend, and casual acquaintance, predicts self-presentation concerns, which then predicts their use of the omission strategy. So this is consistent with the idea that people are worried about how they come across when they say negative things about other people, and so they just avoid saying the negative things. So this leads to the possibility that I've called stereotyping by omission. That is, you can imply a stereotype without saying it by simply what you, for whatever reason, say and don't say. And this I'm adding on Lisa Leslie and Vanessa Constantine because their senior theses were involved in this. Lisa Leslie is now an organizational psychologist whom some of you may know about. So we thought that Americans would be, white Americans in particular, would be particularly likely to use the negativity omission strategy for black targets. Study 2 was a black target, you remember. So we built on the Princeton trilogy methodology. The very first stereotyping study in the United States was done in, or anywhere as far as we know, was done in 1933 at Princeton. Katz and Braley used a methodology where they had 10 national and ethnic groups, and they had 84 adjectives, and the participants' job was for each group to just check the adjectives that they thought applied to that group. And then that method was repeated in a paper published in 1951 and another paper published in 1968. And when I moved to Princeton in 2000, I thought, oh, time to do another one. And so we repeated the methodology. So our predictions in this sort of time series analysis is that there would be more omission of negativity over time because of anti-prejudice norms. So a little historical footnote here. Katz and Braley published this original paper in 1933, and in 1935 they published a paper saying the more socialized a Princeton student is, the more biased they'll be, the more prejudice they'll show. Well, that's changed. So we would predict now the more socialized the Princeton student, the less bias they would show. So that's an example of norms and the influence of norms on the expression of prejudice. But the more the students over time omit the negative dimension, then the more the stereotype as a whole will moderate because the extreme negativity is moderating, but only for the ambivalently negative groups. Okay? So just gives you an example. Here's the Katz-Braley 33 data. We recoded the 84 adjectives along the lines of warmth and competence. And what you see for the original Katz-Braley data is that the English and the Americans are in the high part of the space. So we think, the Brits are like us, only more competent. Or at least they did in 33, think that. Turkish people, I'm sorry to say, are really negative, and this persists, which is really weird because Americans know nothing about Turkish people. But it is what it is. And then you see that Germans and Jews and Chinese and Japanese are in the competent but cold part of the space. And we see this over and over again, that Asians and then in European data, Germans are seen as cold but competent. In this particular data set, Negroes were seen as warm but not competent. So this gives you a sense of what was going on in 1933. So what you can do is look at the groups that are initially negative on one dimension. So on the warmth dimension, the groups that were initially warm were Americans, African Americans, and English people. And the initially cold groups were Turkish people, Jews, Japanese, Chinese, Germans, Italians, and Irish. So what you see, the dotted line is their initial warmth. For the warm groups, the initially warm groups, their warmth rating, it stays flat. It's not going down, it's not going to neutral. But for the initially cold groups, you can see are moderating over time. They're not flipping and becoming suddenly really nice, but they're moderating for being negative. This is in terms of the adjectives people are checking off for them. And if you take a look at the competence data, it's the opposite. So the initially competent groups, their competence ratings don't change over time, but if they're initially cold, they become less cold over time. So there is selective stereotype change over time in this data set with this paradigm such that the negative dimension moderates over time. But we call this stereotyping by omission because if you plot the groups, they stay in the same place relative to each other. So many outgroups are still ambivalent. Whether you present participants with the most common adjectives that students are using to describe other people, so you don't say, it's Americans, but you say this group is whatever they thought the Americans were like, or if you give them the group label, it's the same result, except with one interesting exception that I'll show you. So if you give people the list of adjectives, what you see is that the English are in the same place, the Japanese, Jews, Chinese, and Germans are in the same place, African Americans are in the same place, the Irish and the Italians end up being there with them, which is actually more common than the other result I showed you before. Turks are down here, where they always end up, mysteriously, and Americans are here when you just give the list of adjectives that people apply to Americans. So I'm guessing that the list of adjectives about Americans, this was during the Bush era, Bush II, materialistic, aggressive, warmongering, various things like that. And so people looked at those and said, well, that's not good, right? But if you then instead give them the label American, it goes away. So they think Americans are good, but then they think American characteristics are not so good. But my point is just that if you fail to mention the negative dimension, it doesn't matter to the relative position of the groups in the space. They still look like they did more or less in 1933, when people were more willing to say the negative things. So the negativity omission allows the stereotypes to stagnate over time. Okay, and so that's part two of the argument. Now this only works if listeners get it. So this is the communicator's strategy in talking. Do listeners hear the innuendo? So for the innuendo effect work, it was Hilary Bergseeker also, and Nico Kervin, who's now a professor in Belgium. So the logic is, if many outgroups are viewed ambivalently, as I've argued, and if perceivers compensate and trade off warmth and competence, high on one, low on the other, then when communicators omit the negative and only communicate the positive dimension, as we've said, will listeners specifically say that they think the omitted dimension is negative? Will they get that? we've implied it. We know what people communicate about groups and individuals. We know that stereotypes stagnate, but we haven't shown that the listeners get the process, right? Okay, so the innuendo study, we had an in-group member describing somebody named Pat. Pat is described as high on warmth, high on competence, or just generally a good person, just generally a positive person. We were not specific. And we thought that context might matter. So if I say to you, you know, what do you think of the new department chair? And you say, well, she's really nice. And, right, the implication is that she's not so swift. Or if you say, you know, what do you think about this new graduate student? He's a real geek and a hard worker and really, you know, just does nothing but work all the time. Do you want him to come to the party? Maybe not, right? So part of it is the context should matter, right? If it's a work context, you're expecting to get competence information. If it's a social context, you're expecting to get warmth information. And so it ought to make a difference. I'm here to tell you that, as a spoiler, that it doesn't make a difference, but the other effects are there. So the dependent variables were open-ended descriptions of what the speaker must be thinking. Uh-oh. 60 minutes. Oh, it's the fans go off after 60 minutes. If anybody is dying of heat, you can tell me. And then what the speaker must be saying are the absolute ratings of warmth and competence. And then the listener's opinion about relative likability and capability compared with others. And then we wanted to know if these perceptions are consequential. So we wanted to know whether people would want to include this person, Pat, in a group, a work group, or a social group, because it's more interesting if the trait, you know, if the trait dimensions are implying something behavioral. Okay. So, for the warmth ratings, if the speaker mentions warmth, not surprisingly, people infer more warmth. That's the dark gray bar. If it's a positive impression overall, they infer warmth, but not a gigantic amount of warmth. But relative to that, if they mention competence, the warmth rating goes down below what it goes down in the baseline condition. There's no logical necessity for that, but that's what happens. The same thing happens if you mention competence. Sorry, for the competence ratings. If you mention competence, not surprisingly, the ratings are high. If it's generally positive, they're less high. But if you mention warmth, they assume that the warmth is lower than it is in the baseline condition. So if you mention one dimension and leave out the other one, sorry for the cameraman, then people infer it's lower than baseline, right? So the innuendo is coming across. People are getting it, that what you're leaving out must be bad. And oh, by the way, the context doesn't matter. So we have the social context and the work context, and it looks about the same. However, context matters in the sense that it's the contextually salient dimension that mediates the effect. So if the outcome variable is suitability for inclusion in the group, whatever kind of group it is, if it's a work group, it's the competence dimension, and if it's a social group, it's the warmth dimension that mediates the effect, both for absolute and relative ratings. Okay, so not satisfied, and this is before the replication crisis, we decided to replicate. This case with male and female targets, so that's study 2A. And then with 2B, we gave the participants in study 2A wrote open-ended descriptions. We gave those to people in study 2B to see if they would get the innuendo. So what you see is for the contextually salient dimension, this is the description for warmth. People infer warmth, but they assume that competence is low and vice versa. So if you mention the dimension, there's a trade-off again where people are, except for male targets at work, but it's strongest for female targets at work. So there's a little bit of a context effect. So we took this as evidence that listeners are hearing the innuendo. They're assuming that if you leave it out, it must be bad. And it has consequences for who you want to hire and hang out with. So then the question was, would this communication strategy be something that impression managers use? So if communicators do it and listeners get it, do people use it strategically when they want to convey a certain impression? So, for example, sometimes women traditionally have played dumb in order to be seen as nicer, right? That's the strategy. And so Deborah Son-Haloin and I did some studies on this. In her scenario, people had to convey an image to a chat room. We told them the people in this chat room want you to be warm, or they want you to be competent, or they just want you to be positive. And we gave them a choice of which warmth and competence questions they wanted to answer about themselves to introduce themselves to the people in the chat room. So what you see is, when they're trying to be warm, they pick more warmth things, that's obvious, but they pick fewer cognitive things, fewer competence things. In the control condition, warmth is higher than competence, but it's exaggerated when they're trying to be warm. And it flips when they're trying to be competent. They pick competent adjectives, but the interesting thing is they pick way fewer warmth adjectives. So again, they're using the trade-off in order to convey a desired impression. And then she did several different studies looking at it from different angles, and it works each time. So now we get into the status part of this talk. And this is work with Jill Swencionis that's under review and in progress. So in Deborah's work, we showed that you could tell people to be warm or competent and they would get the trade-off as the thing to do. So this time we tried a slightly subtler manipulation of social goals. And we said, the interviewer that you're interviewing with wants team players, or the person wants efficient workers. And this is based on some project that Don Operario and I did a number of years ago. And again, it was the number of traits that people would share about themselves, warmth or competence ones. So the emphasis is on ingratiating yourself, being a team player, yes or no, promoting yourself, being an efficient worker, yes or no, and what trait dimension. So what you see in the case where people are self-promoting, that is, they're trying to be competent, they use more competence traits and downplay the warmth traits. I mean, there's no reason why they couldn't do both, but they don't. It flips when they're trying to ingratiate themselves, that is, when they're trying to seem likable. In the both condition and the neither condition, it's about equal. There is a baseline slight bias toward competence, but it gets exaggerated by these specific goals. So different ways of manipulating the social goal that somebody has, whether it's direct, whether you tell them to be a certain way, or whether you say the interviewer wants certain things, changes it. Okay, so let's talk about status comparisons. When I showed you the stereotype content model, what I didn't say is what predicts a group's apparent warmth and apparent competence. So if people think a group is competitive, they think they're not nice. If they think they're cooperative, they think they're nice. So there's a structural relationship between groups that can be cooperative or competitive, and that predicts warmth. The status dimension predicts competence. So much to my surprise, all over the world, every place we've been, if a group is high status, people think they're more competent. Meritocracy rules. And the correlation is on the order of, say, 0.8. I mean, it's really surprising. I expected some sour grapes, where people would say, those people may be rich, but they're well connected, they had all the advantages, they marry each other, and they're actually not that smart. But nobody agreed with my view. So it seemed to us that if a high status person can assume that they're believed to be competent, then what they're worried about is that the other person thinks they're therefore cold. And so they would be concerned about their warmth. The low status person can't assume that they're competent, and so what they want is respect, and what the high status person wants is liking. And so you have people at different status levels with two different goals in the conversation, and it's awkward to say the least. So status will determine which ones when. High status speakers are talking down warmly, low status speakers are talking up competently. You could call the behavior of the high status speakers patronizing, right? Because they're focusing on the nice dimension and not focusing on having a competent interchange. So we set up a scenario. We told, these are M-Turkers, online participants. We said, suppose there's a new workplace initiative. You're being paired with a coworker who ranks higher or lower than you. We had them think of somebody, write down their initials. We said they were from a different division, so they wouldn't be outcome dependent on this person, or vice versa. And we gave them a choice of traits. How much do you want your partner to know? Warmth and competence traits about you. And then also we asked them for their self-report of the goal they had in that interaction. Is your goal to come across as warm or as competent? And the comparison is upward versus downward versus neither in the trait dimensions. So what you see is when people are comparing down from the top to the bottom, their emphasis is on warmth. When they're comparing up, it flips. Their emphasis is on competence. And when they're neither, it's about the same. So even in this hypothetical workplace initiative with somebody in their company that they're thinking of, they say what they would reveal. And if you ask them on a trade-off scale from warmth to competence, how important is it to be each, they report when they're comparing down, they want to be relatively more warm, and when they're comparing up, they want to be relatively more competent on a scale from warmth to competence. So they can report the goal. So there's two possibilities going on here. One is that people could be worried about how they come across, and so they're trying to compensate for the negative dimension of their position. Or it could be that they're concerned about matching the person who is opposite to them in the trait configuration. So one way to look at this is to manipulate the characteristics of the other person to flip their warmth and competence. So if I say there's a boss who's actually really a nice person as well as being competent, right, or I say there's an underling who's really competent as well as being nice, it should make the effect go away if you're worried about matching. So in two different studies we presented a person who was counter-stereotypic on friendliness or counter-stereotypic on intelligence. Same workplace initiative, plus you hear from a coworker that this person is very friendly or not friendly, in one study very intelligent or not very intelligent. Okay, so it's the same design as before. So in the stereotypic situation, we replicate what we found before. So if you're comparing up, then you expect the boss not to be very friendly, and so you focus on competence traits. And if you're comparing down, you expect the underling to be friendly, and so you focus on warmth traits. Okay, so that just replicates what we've seen before. When you present a very friendly boss or a not very friendly subordinate, the effect goes away. So it's possible that part of what people are doing is trying to match the other person. It's possible, but it doesn't completely reverse, so it's not taking care of the whole thing. We get the same thing on the competence dimension. You replicate the basic effect when you have stereotypic expectations about intelligence, and it goes away pretty much or attenuates when you give counter-stereotypic information. So these status comparisons do create impression management goals and compensatory self-presentation strategies, ingratiation with a trade-off, and self-promotion again with a trade-off, and compensation reduces when you give counter-stereotypic information. So it's possible that part of it is about matching what you assume to be true of the other person. Unfortunately, it doesn't totally make the effect flip, so it's not only the stereotypic information. What I personally think is going on is that there are two different things happening. For the low status person, they're more aware of the other person, and there's a lot of research indicating that low status people are more tuned in to the higher status people, and so probably they are more matching. But for the higher status person, I think it's all about me. and they're worried about how they come across. And so I think a lot of the work on social class and on status suggests that there's an asymmetry in the mediators, so it makes it complicated. It's very unsatisfying to have two different mediators, two different conditions. So the last part of this talk is going to focus on race with Sidney Dupree. Again, this is work that's in progress. So the thought was that in American society, being black or being white is an implicit statement about status. And so we would expect that you might see whites talking to a black or a white partner as enacting these status dynamics that we've just talked about. We do have a study with black participants, but they're harder to get, and I'm not going to report it here, but it's not inconsistent. So we focused in on whites self-presenting their warmth and competence to a white or black partner. We predicted that they would be, as the high status group in society, they would be worried about being liked. I'm not racist. So they would be more warm with the black partner, but correspondingly they'd be less competent with the black partner, which is a sort of patronizing way to behave. This extends some previous research that Hilary Bergseeker, Nicole Shelton, and Jen Richardson did, where they looked at online actual interactions between people, but we're examining both warmth and competence simultaneously and looking at the self-reported goals. Can people talk about what they're trying to do in this context? So white students at Princeton, their interaction partner was white or black. It was a book club scenario. And as a new member of the book club, you've been assigned to email the club secretary, Emily, a stereotypically white name, or Lakeisha, a stereotypically black name. And we gave them word choices about words they might use in a book review. So the high competence words were tough vocabulary words, and the low ones were simple vocabulary words. The warmth words were positive things to say in the book review or negative things to say in the book review. So a word could be simple and negative or positive, so it's fully crossed. So what you see is that when they're talking to a white partner, the interaction is significant, the comparison is marginal, but they're presenting more competence words to the white partner than to the black partner. The warmth dimension flips, but it's not significant. In general, we're finding in these data, we've done a whole bunch of studies like this, that the competence result is quite reliable and the warmth result is less reliable. But in effect, the students are talking down to their black partner. When we ask them what their goals are, their reported goals are, with a black partner, the red bars, to be more kind and likable. So they're trying to be kind and likable, and to be kind and likable, they're using simpler language. Why is that kind and likable? So one question we had was whether this might have something to do with students' liberal bias. And so we went online to MTurk again, and we wondered whether right-wing authoritarianism might be a moderating variable among white MTurkers. So right-wing authoritarianism is a measure of social conservatism, and it's about sort of conservative social values. So you would expect Princeton students to be low on RWA because they're generally more liberal than not. And so for the white MTurkers, we would get more variability in RWA, and we would expect maybe some differences, so that if anything, the low RWA MTurkers would replicate what the Princeton students did, and the highs might not. And that's what you see. So in the partner race by right-wing authoritarianism interaction, what you see is it's the low RWAs who are giving less competence information to the black than the white partner. It's the blue line. Whereas the high RWAs, the yellow line, are not differentiating. So it's the nice liberal people who are talking down. It gets worse. This is the effect you see with means. So, before we manipulated the stereotypicality of the partner, we thought if we say Lakeisha is a Phi Beta Kappa member, maybe that would make the effect go away. And for their explicit goals, what you see is that they become more concerned about conveying competence, their own competence and intelligence, and you flip the effect. So for a high competence black partner, they want to convey more competence information than they do for just an unspecified black partner. And again, the warmth data seem to show the effect, but it's more variable and less strong. Okay, so here's where it gets really bad. As the final study, and I can say this is brilliant because it was Sydney's total idea herself. We thought we might look at RWA as a substituted in Democratic or Republican Party membership. And she found in archival data 38 presidential campaign speeches of white presidential candidates to minority audiences, and then found comparable speeches to white audiences. So those are the 4 presidential candidates she looked at. She was able to find 24 speeches to minority audiences by Democrats and 14 from Republicans. So the good news is the Democrats are showing up. The bad news is when you look at warmth and competence words, you do a linguistic analysis of the kinds of warmth and competence words that they're using, where the dictionary uses agentic and communal words, but that's very close to warmth and competence. What you see is that the Republicans are not showing any significant difference, and the Democrats are. So the Democrats are using way more agentic words to white audiences than to black audiences. And they're using marginally more communal words to minority audiences. So this phenomenon that we saw in the Princeton students and in the low RWA M-Turkers, the presidential candidates are doing the same thing by, if they're Democrats. So, you know, you got to go where the data take you. It's not what I would have predicted, not what I particularly, you know, I have political biases, not particularly what I wanted to see, but it's there. So, the argument I've made is that communicators, if they're being polite, omit negativity. It creates innuendo, which allows stereotypes to stagnate over the 75 years of the Princeton Katz and Braley trilogy. Listeners hear the innuendo, they get it. Impression managers use innuendo, they play up one dimension and downplay the other. And status determines which one people do when. Whether its status is operationalized as workplace rank or as black and white participants, and people are talking at cross purposes. One group wants to be liked, the other group wants to be respected, and they're not on the same page. So, thank you for listening, and here are my collaborators to whom I'm very grateful. And thank you for being here. So we have lots of time for questions and clarifications. And I have 20 other slides I could show you. If you just want me to ask the right question, I'll show it to you. Yes?
So you said that people are using different strategies, or they're emphasizing different things when they're interacting with other people. Do you have any sort of measures of like the outcomes of those interactions?
You know, this question's coming up a lot, and so I'm thinking we have to do that. I mean, what we have is, we have that people get it. But whether, when you're doing a cross-status conversation, whether the other person likes it or not, I mean, I would have to predict they don't particularly like it because they have a different goal than you do and they're not working. Whether people convey the impression they want to convey, we have a little bit of, indirect evidence for that from the impression management studies, and if people do what those folks do, people do, make those decisions. But how it comes across in the sort of simultaneous, these people are missing each other, I don't know. Yes?
I'm just curious, did you look at the SES effect across the racial groups in your last study?
Of the participants? Yeah, we have. We don't see anything there.
Okay.
I mean, in general, RWA is correlated with SES. Contrary to what you might think, Princeton students are not all rich people. 60% of them are on financial aid, but they're not down and out, certainly not while they're at Princeton. So, would you have a prediction?
No, I was just curious.
Yeah, no, we did look at it and it wasn't satisfying. Otherwise, I would be telling you about it. Yes?
So a college campus is a status environment, and do you see this kind of four-way interaction on status play out on a campus among different departments, for example?
Oh, different departments.
So you've got your natural sciences that bring in all the grants, right? And then you've got your humanities that are very valuable, but they're told, bring in more grants. And so that's a low status position among the administration.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on whether the high status natural scientists want to get along. Some of my best friends are natural scientists, but
I mean, it strikes me
but
that-
I mean, they would have to be in a situation where they cared about getting along with each other.
Yeah. It strikes me that the talking down, the envy,
Right.
organization, those all sound familiar.
Yeah. I'm not sure what the goals reports would be. I mean, I think probably the humanities people would report they want to be respected. But I'm not sure the natural sciences people would necessarily report that they want to be liked by their colleagues. I mean, they want respect too. I don't know, it's an interesting way to operationalize it. Yeah. Food for thought. Could be. Yes.
Well, I think it's similar to the question we got about an outcome, right? So it's like putting people in a situation that's very abstract, and so they just map whatever into that, versus putting them in a situation where they're trying to accomplish a goal
Right.
that's attached to a particular outcome, and to see to what extent the effects are robust under those conditions, where they've got a particular motivation they're trying to pursue.
Well, I mean, that's one of the reasons we went to the Democratic and Republican speech givers. And then we see it in a different way in the who would you want in your group, even though it's a hypothetical situation. And then I think, the change over time in what Princeton students report about different groups, I think that does reflect changing norms. Another thing that happens with the Princeton students is more of them refuse to do it at all, which is interesting about, norms, about stereotypes. Is this actual hiring and firing? No. So the Donna Pereiro study that we did a long time ago, we actually set up a situation where we had interviewers who we measured to be high on dominance, CPI dominance measure, or low on dominance, and then people who were interviewing for a job that emphasized either team playing or being efficient. And there was actually a job at the end of it that was potentially available, so it wasn't totally hypothetical. And what we found is that the interviewees ingratiated and self-promoted depending on what was wanted. They got that. And the high dominance interviewers, they loved being ingratiated too. Just keep, ingratiating yourself to me. And they wanted to have coffee with the person. If we said, do you want to have coffee with the person? They say, oh yeah, I want to have coffee. But they wouldn't hire the person. So we see some of these dynamics of sort of, it's like a novice job interviewee who thinks, well, the interviewer really liked me. That's fine, but they have to respect you to want to hire you, right? So, we have, these are not studies in real world organizations, but I have no reason to doubt that they wouldn't be the same. Yes?
Have you thought about test the two dimensions, warmth versus confidence, within different national groups? I'm just thinking about some cultural perspective perspectives may have some impact on these two dimensions while people are talking?
Yeah, I think there must be cultural variations on it. We haven't seen, when we compare the cultural maps, we don't see that some cultures spread out the competence dimension and others spread out the warmth dimension. We don't see that. Sometimes we see that there's more of a correlation between warmth and competence, so it's basically a general halo effect or not, and I could talk about that separately. But in terms of whether they use the warmth dimension more or the competence dimension more, I don't have any evidence of that, one way or the other. But it might well be true. You know, Americans might be sort of goofy about caring about warmth, you know, and somebody who's sociable and, you know, fun to be around. I don't know. Or it might be different. Do you have a hypothesis about it?
I don't know. I just think about like some cultural perspectives, such as like high contact versus low contact.
Right.
People may actually they want to infer some meaning, but it's like different dynamics as people infer the two meanings in culture like here.
Right.
It's from my kind of experience and some studies like that.
Yeah, the compensation effect per se, I think, has been tested in different cultural contexts. So Yoshi Kashima was one of the co-authors, and I think they did one of their studies in East Asia. I'm not 100% sure about that. But so I don't think that the compensation, the trade-off effect, is culturally that specific. And in East Asian countries, for example, we get groups, a lot of ambivalent groups, high on one dimension and low on the other. But in terms of the strategies that people use and what they're looking for, I don't have data about that. I can tell you about the cultural patterns. You want to know about the cultural patterns? Of course you do. Okay, so there are two and a half interesting cultural findings. One cultural finding is when we do the stereotype content model in East Asia, what we find is groups in 3 of the 4 parts of the space. The high part of the space that Westerners reserve for the in-group, those groups migrate to a sort of more modest, humble middle part of the space. So people are saying, my in-group is okay, but yours is worse. Right? So the rest of the groups are in the same place they always are. Rich people, poor people, old people. They're in the same part of the space as before. So that's one cultural finding. Another cultural finding is, and this is in the paper that Durante and a bunch of people published together, the ambivalent parts of the space are more useful in places with a lot of income inequality, like the United States. So if you have a lot of income inequality, you can calm people down by saying they're deserving poor, they're undeserving poor, right? There are some poor people, they're all low status, but some of them are nice and some of them are not nice. They're deserving rich and undeserving rich. And so you can't just hate the status dimension too much because it's more complicated. And what we see is there's a 0.35 correlation between income inequality measured by the Gini coefficient and the warmth competence correlation, which tells you whether you've got a cloud of points or a vector. So that's kind of cool. And then the half a finding is, so you can get this vector by having a highly equal country where everybody's eligible for the social safety net except for the Roma, the refugees, and these, you know, nameless outsiders who you hate. But then, you know, there's some differentiation, but it's among the in-group who is eligible for the social safety net, but it varies a little bit. So that's one way to get the vector. But the other way to get the vector, instead of the cloud of points, is to have a high conflict society, we think. So that's why I can't say for sure that this is happening. At least in some high conflict settings, what you get is us versus them, because you can't afford to be subtle. There are people who are on your side and people who are not, and that's the way it is. But we're still gathering data in some of those countries, so I can't say for sure. I'll give you another half a factoid, and then I'll stop. So the counterintuitive result whereby old people are disrespected all over the world. We have actually a meta-analysis that's under revised review showing that it's the same all over the world, and it seems to be a function of industrialization. The more industrialized the country, the more they disrespect their old people. That's great, huh? The two exceptions that are really, really salient are African Americans rating subtypes of African Americans and people rating subtypes of Native Americans. In those cases, elders are respected. But they're referred to not as just old people, but elders. So, or in various terms. But so there is, for those of us who are getting older, you know, there's some hope in sub communities, but the overall news is not good, and you know, as you get older, retiring to East Asia is not going to help. But anyway, so I want to thank you for listening to the various speculations and data. Appreciate it.
We have a small gift as a token of appreciation for Dr. Fiske to take a time out of her
Here.
busy schedule to come
So
share her
she's going to take a picture, so we should stand in front of her.
Okay. So taking time out of her busy schedule to share her research and insights with us. So.
And this is who knows what.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So reminder to join us upstairs if your schedule permits for the reception, which is in honor of our invited speaker and the winner of the Joseph L. White Award. Thank you very much for coming.
So shall I
It's a
look at-
clock.